was pitch black, the moon obscured by thick, rolling clouds that seemed to suffocate the sky. A thin mist hung low over the ground, twisting and turning through the dense forest that lined both sides of the narrow road. The headlights of a lone car pierced through the darkness, casting an eerie glow on the trees that seemed to close in around the vehicle. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a stark contrast to the deafening silence of the woods. Kenta and his younger sister, Yumi, were on their way back from a late night visit to their grandparents' house in a rural part of Japan. Their parents had insisted they stay overnight, but Kenta, feeling confident in his driving skills, decided to make the journey back to Tokyo. Yumi, sitting in the passenger seat, was uneasy about the drive through the forest, especially at this hour. "I don't like this, Kenta," Yumi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These woods have always given me the creeps." Kenta glanced at her, offering a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Yumi. It's just a forest. We'll be out of here in no time." But as the road twisted and turned, the feeling of unease grew. The trees, tall and ancient, seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The mist thickened, wrapping around the car like a ghostly shroud. Suddenly, the headlights caught something on the side of the road, a fleeting glimpse of a figure, pale and gaunt, standing motionless. "Did you see that?" Yumi's voice trembled. Kenta shook his head. "It was probably just a deer. This area is full of wildlife." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The figure had looked almost human, but something about it was off. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to follow the car as they passed. They drove on in silence, the atmosphere inside the car growing tenser with each passing minute. The road, barely wide enough for two cars, seemed to stretch on endlessly, winding deeper into the forest. The GPS signal had long since disappeared, leaving them to rely on Kenta's memory and the old, barely readable map his grandfather had given him. "Are we lost?" Yumi asked, her voice small. Kenta sighed, his confidence waning. "No, we're not lost. Just taking the scenic route." But the truth was, he wasn't sure anymore. The road looked unfamiliar, and the further they went, the more it felt like they were being drawn into a trap. The car's radio, previously silent, suddenly crackled to life, emitting a series of strange, garbled noises. Kenta tried to tune it to a station, but all he got was static. Frustrated, he turned it off, but the sense of dread only intensified. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught another glimpse of movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. "Stop the car," Yumi said suddenly, her voice firm. Kenta hesitated. "Why?" "I need to check something," she insisted. Reluctantly, Kenta pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the gravel. Yumi stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She walked a few steps into the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. Kenta watched her, his nerves on. "For example, Yumi, what are you doing? Get back in the car." But Yumi didn't respond. She stood there, staring into the darkness, as if drawn by some unseen force. And then she saw a faint light, flickering in the distance, deep within the woods. "There's something out there," she said, her voice barely audible. Kenta got out of the car and joined her, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see what she was looking at. The light was faint, but it was definitely there, moving slowly through the trees. "Let's go back," he said, his voice tight with fear. "We shouldn't be out here." But Yumi was already moving, her feet carrying her towards the light. Kenta had no choice but to follow, his heart racing. They walked deeper into the forest, the mist swirling around their ankles. The light grew brighter, leading them further and further away from the road. Kenta tried to call out to Yumi, to tell her to stop, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. And then they reached a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated shrine, its wooden structure rotting and covered in moss. The light they had been following was gone, leaving them in an eerie, almost unnatural silence. "What is this place?" Kenta asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yumi didn't answer. She was staring at the shrine, her eyes wide with fear and fascination. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch the weathered wood. "Yumi, don't," Kenta started, but it was too late. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a cold wind swept through the clearing, and the air was filled with a chilling, otherworldly wail. Kenta grabbed Yumi's arm and pulled her back, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. But as they turned to leave, they realized they were no longer alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and empty. Kenta and Yumi backed away, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The figures moved closer, their footsteps silent on the forest floor. "Run!" Kenta shouted, grabbing Yumi's hand and pulling her towards the car. They sprinted through the forest, the figures following them, their presence like a cold hand on the back of their necks. They reached the car and scrambled inside, Kenta fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, the figures fading into the darkness behind them. As they drove, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees bending and twisting in unnatural ways. Kenta kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Yumi was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. "That shrine, it was cursed," she whispered. Kenta nodded, his throat dry. "We need to get out of these woods now." But the road seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The mist grew thicker, and the sense of being watched never left them. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, it was impossible to tell. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the mist cleared, and they found themselves back on the familiar road. The lights of Tokyo glowing faintly in the distance. They drove in silence, the terror of the night still clinging to them. As they reached the city, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a pale glow on the streets. Kenta pulled over and parked the car, his hands still shaking. Yumi looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "Let's never speak of this again," she said softly. Kenta nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Agreed. They sat there for a moment, letting the reality of their experience sink in. And then, without another word, they drove home, leaving the haunted woods and the horrors they had encountered far behind. But deep down, they both knew that the memories of that night would never truly fade. The shadows of the forest, the figures in the darkness, and the eerie, haunting wail would stay with them forever. A chilling reminder of the night they drove through the haunted woods. The dawn light had brought a fleeting sense of relief, but the oppressive memory of the forest clung to Kenta and Yumi like a second skin. Back in the safety of their Tokyo apartment, the siblings struggled to shake off the remnants of their harrowing night. Kenta sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a steaming cup of coffee, his mind replaying the events over and over. Yumi, pale and visibly shaken, was curled up on the couch, clutching a blanket as if it could protect her from the unseen horrors that lurked in her thoughts. Do you think we'll ever forget what happened?" Yumi's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide and haunted. Kenta shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Yumi. I don't know if something like that can ever be forgotten." Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, their shapes almost resembling the figures they had seen in the forest. Kenta rubbed his temples, trying to push the memories away. "We need to tell someone," Yumi said suddenly, her voice trembling but determined. Kenta looked at her, his expression conflicted. "Who would believe us? It sounds insane." "Maybe Grandpa would understand," Yumi suggested, her eyes pleading. Their grandfather had always been a storyteller, his tales often filled with supernatural elements and local legends. Perhaps he would have some insight, some way to make sense of what they had experienced. Kenta sighed, knowing she was right. "All right, let's call him." With a trembling hand, Yumi picked up the phone and dialed their grandfather's number. The line rang for what felt like an eternity. before a familiar, raspy voice answered, "Hello, Grandpa, it's Yumi. Kenta and I. We need to talk to you about something that happened last night." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a deep, thoughtful sigh. "Come over. I'll be waiting." They arrived at their grandfather's house just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The familiar creak of the wooden steps under their feet brought a small measure of comfort. Their grandfather, a weathered old man with kind eyes and a wealth of knowledge, hidden behind his quiet demeanor, greeted them at the door. Come in," he said, ushering them inside. They sat around the old wooden table in the dimly lit kitchen, the air heavy with the scent of tea and aged wood. Their grandfather listened intently as Kenta and Yumi recounted their ordeal, his expression growing more serious with each passing detail. When they finished, he sat in silence for a moment, his eyes distant as if he were recalling some long-forgotten memory. "I was afraid this day might come," he said finally, his voice a mixture of sadness and resignation. Kenta and Yumi exchanged worried glances. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" Kenta asked. Their grandfather took a deep breath. "The forest you drove through. It's not an ordinary place. It's known as the Yuri no More Forest of Spirits." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Long ago, it was the site of many tragedies. Wars, famines, and countless lives lost. The spirits of those who perished there never found peace. They linger, trapped between this world and the next, unable to move on. Yumi shuddered, her mind racing back to the figures they had seen. "But why us? Why now?" "The forest has a way of calling to those who are sensitive to its presence," their grandfather explained. "It lures them in, feeding on their fear and confusion." Kenta felt a chill run down his spine. Is there a way to stop it? To make sure it doesn't happen again? Their grandfather nodded slowly. "There is a way, but it's dangerous. It requires facing the spirits directly and helping them find peace." Yumi's eyes widened. "You mean we have to go back?" Their grandfather's expression was grim. "Yes, but you won't be alone. I'll guide you as best I can. There are rituals, old ways that can help, but it won't be easy." Kenta felt a mixture of fear and determination welling up inside him. "We'll do it. We can't let this happen to anyone else." Yumi nodded, her resolve hardening. "Yes, we have to try." Their grandfather smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Good. We'll start tonight. There's no time to waste." As night fell once more, Kenta, Yumi, and their grandfather prepared for their journey back into the heart of the forest, armed with ancient rituals and a newfound sense of purpose. They set out to confront the spirits that haunted their memories. The road to the forest was eerily familiar, the darkness seeming to close in around them even before they reached the edge of the trees. Kenta's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yumi sat beside him, clutching a bundle of ritual items their grandfather had given her. The old man sat in the back, his presence a steadying force amidst the growing tension. As they entered the forest, the air grew colder, the mists rising once more to envelop the car. The familiar sense of unease settled over them. But this time they were prepared. They reached the clearing where the old shrine stood, its presence even more foreboding than before. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Their grandfather stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm. He began to chant softly, the words of the ritual flowing smoothly from his lips. Kenta and Yumi followed his lead, their voices joining his in the ancient invocation. The atmosphere around them seemed to shift, the air growing colder and heavier. From the shadows, the figures began to emerge once more, their forms ghostly and indistinct. But this time, instead of fear, Kenta and Yumi felt a strange sense of empathy. These were not malevolent beings, but lost souls trapped in their own torment. Their grandfather's chanting grew louder, the words resonating with a power that seemed to reach into the very depths of the forest. The figures paused, their hollow eyes fixed on the small group. Yumi stepped forward, her voice steady. "We are here to help you find peace." The figures seemed to hesitate, their forms flickering like candle flames. Kenta joined her, his voice strong. "We know your pain. We feel your sorrow. Let us guide you to the light." The ritual continued, the air crackling with a palpable energy. The figures began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, as if drawn towards an unseen force. One by one, they approached the shrine, their forms becoming more solid, their features more human. Tears streamed down Yumi's face as she watched them, her heart aching for the suffering they had endured. Kenta felt a lump in his throat, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Their grandfather's chanting reached a crescendo, the final words echoing through the clearing like a thunderclap. The figures paused at the entrance of the shrine, their eyes meeting Kenta and Yumi's for a brief, poignant moment. Then, with a final, mournful sigh, they vanished, their forms dissolving into the mist. The air around them seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting as the spirits found their peace at last. Kenta and Yumi stood in silence, their hearts heavy with the bittersweetness of their success. Their grandfather approached, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. "You did well. The spirits are at rest now." Kenta nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Grandpa. We couldn't have done it without you." Yumi wiped her tears, her smile tentative but genuine. "It's over. They're free." As they made their way back to the car, the forest seemed to part for them, the trees no longer looming ominously. The drive back to Tokyo was quiet, the weight of their experience settling over them like a comforting blanket. They knew that the memory of the haunted woods would stay with them, a permanent scar etched into their souls. But they also knew that they had done something important, something meaningful. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side, stronger and more resilient. And as the lights of Tokyo appeared on the horizon, they felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace that had been hard-won but deeply deserved. The next few days passed in a blur of uneasy calm for Kenta and Yumi. Their encounter with the spirits of Yuri no more had left an indelible mark on their minds, though they had helped the spirits find peace. The fear and uncertainty lingered, casting a shadow over their daily lives. One evening, as they sat in their dimly lit living room, a sense of restlessness grew between them. Kenta gazed out the window, his mind replaying the events over and over. "We need to understand more," he said, breaking the silence. Yumi looked up from her book, her eyes weary but attentive. "What do you mean?" "We need to know why the forest is cursed, why those spirits were trapped there. Maybe then we can find some closure." Yumi nodded slowly, the determination in her brother's voice stirring something within her. "You're right. But where do we start?" Kenta stood up, his eyes bright with purpose. "We start with the history of the place. Grandpa mentioned old tragedies, wars, and famines. We need to dig deeper." Their first stop was the local library, a place of quiet solitude that offered a stark contrast to the turmoil in their minds. The musty smell of old books filled the air as they searched through archives and historical records. Hours passed, and just as they were about to give up, Yumi stumbled upon an old, dusty journal hidden at the back of a shelf. "Kenta, look at this," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. Kenta joined her, his eyes widening as he saw the faded cover. It was a journal from the Edo period, written by a local villager. As they carefully turned the pages, the story began to unfold. The village near Yuri no more had been a prosperous place, until a series of misfortunes struck. A devastating famine, followed by a brutal war, had ravaged the land. The villagers, desperate and starving, had resorted to dark rituals, hoping to appease the spirits and bring back prosperity. But the rituals had gone horribly wrong, unleashing a curse that bound the spirits to the forest for eternity. The journal described the anguish and despair of the villagers as they realized the terrible mistake they had made. Their attempts to reverse the curse had only made things worse, trapping the spirits in an endless cycle of suffering. Kenta and Yumi exchanged grim looks as they closed the journal. "We need to find the site of the rituals," Kenta said, his voice firm. "If we can understand what went wrong, maybe we can find a way to lift the curse for good." The journey back to the forest was filled with a sense of foreboding. Armed with the knowledge from the journal, they felt a mix of hope and dread. Their grandfather had given them his blessing, but he had also warned them of the dangers they face as they approached the edge of the forest. The familiar chill in the air greeted them. The mist swirled around their feet, and the shadows seemed to whisper their secrets. Guided by the journal's descriptions, they ventured deeper into the forest, the oppressive silence pressing down on them. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, its surface covered in moss and weathered by time. "This must be the place," Yumi said, her voice barely audible. Kenta nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "Let's get to work." They carefully examined the altar, their fingers tracing the intricate carvings that adorned its surface. The symbols matched those described in the journal, confirming that they had found the right spot. As they began to set up for the ritual, a sense of urgency gripped them. The sun was setting, and the forest seemed to come alive. With the approaching darkness, Yumi lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the trees. Kenta prepared the offerings, his hands steady despite the growing tension. They began to chant the ancient words, their voices blending with the rustling of the leaves. The air around them grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in. But they pressed on, their resolve unwavering. As the final words of the chant echoed through the clearing, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles. The forest fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting for a brief moment. Kenta and Yumi held their breath, waiting for a sign that the ritual had worked. But instead of the expected peace, a low, mournful wail filled the air. The ground beneath the altar trembled, and the shadows began to twist and contort, forming ghostly figures. Kenta and Yumi stepped back, their hearts pounding. The spirits, no longer bound to the forest, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes filled with an unsettling mixture of anger and sorrow. "You cannot undo what has been done," one of the spirits said, its voice echoing with centuries of pain. "The curse is beyond your power." Despair washed over them as the spirits advanced, their forms flickering like dying embers. But just as all seemed lost, their grandfather's voice rang out from the darkness. "Stand firm, children. Do not let fear consume you." Kenta and Yumi turned to see their grandfather, his presence a beacon of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. He stepped forward, his voice strong and unwavering. "The curse may be beyond their power, but not beyond ours." With a gesture, he summoned a protective circle around them, the spirits recoiling from its light. "We can help you find peace," he continued, his eyes fixed on the spirits. "But you must let go of your anger and sorrow." The spirits hesitated, their forms wavering. "We have suffered for so long," one of them whispered, its voice filled with despair. "We know," their grandfather said gently, "and we will help you if you allow us." Slowly, the spirits began to calm, their anger fading. As they listened to his words, Kenta and Yumi joined their grandfather, their voices steady as they continued the ritual. The air around them crackled with energy, the oppressive weight lifting as the spirits' forms began to dissolve. One by one, they found peace, their anguished cries fading into the night. As the last spirit vanished, a profound silence fell over the forest. Kenta, Yumi, and their grandfather stood in the clearing, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they had witnessed. "The curse is lifted," their grandfather said, his voice filled with quiet relief. "But remember, the forest will always hold its secrets." They nodded, understanding the weight of his words. As they made their way back through the forest, the darkness seemed less threatening, the shadows less menacing. They had faced the curse of Yuri no more and emerged stronger for it. But the memory of the spirit's suffering would stay with them, a reminder of the fragile balance between the living and the dead. Back in Tokyo, life gradually returned to normal. But the bond between Kenta, Yumi, and their grandfather had deepened. Forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal, they knew that the forest's secrets would remain with them, a part of their family's history. And as they looked towards the future, they carried with them the knowledge that even in the darkest of places, there was always the possibility of redemption and peace. The early morning mist clung to the trees like a shroud as Takashi drove back to Route 345. The road, now a familiar haunt, felt different in the pale dawn light. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Takashi had spent the last few days piecing together the final fragments of Yuki's story, determined to uncover the whole truth. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden hue over the landscape, he reached the spot where he had first encountered Yuki. The roadside was quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional chirping of birds. Takashi parked his car and stepped out. Feeling the cool morning air on his face, he walked along the edge of the road, his eyes scanning the area for any clues he might have missed. It was here, amidst the tall grass and wildflowers, that he had found Yuki that fateful night. Now he hoped to find something that would finally put her spirit to rest. Takashi's investigation had led him to a startling discovery. Yuki's death was not just a tragic accident, or the result of her lover's betrayal. There was something more sinister at play. He had found evidence of a cover-up involving powerful people in the neighboring village who wanted to keep their secrets buried. Yuki had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that had cost her her life. Determined to bring justice to Yuki and expose the truth, Takashi had gathered all the evidence he needed. He had the journal, the records from the temple, and the testimonies of villagers who had known Yuki. It was time to confront those responsible and ensure that Yuki's story was told. As he stood by the roadside, lost in thought, he heard a car approaching. It was Hiroshi, the temple priest, who had been his ally throughout this journey. Hiroshi stepped out of the car, his expression grave. "Are you ready?" he asked. Takashi nodded, his resolve unwavering. They drove together to the neighboring village, their destination a large, imposing house on the outskirts. It belonged to a man named Sato, a powerful figure who had connections to the underworld and had been involved in the events leading to Yuki's death. The house loomed ahead, its dark facade a stark contrast to the brightening sky. Takashi and Hiroshi approached the front door, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Takashi knocked, the sound echoing ominously. After a moment, the door opened, revealing Sato's stern face. "What do you want?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Takashi. "We need to talk," Takashi said firmly, holding up the journal. "It's about Yuki." Sato's expression shifted, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Takashi and Hiroshi followed Sato into a spacious living room, where they sat facing him. "What is this about?" Sato asked, his voice strained. Takashi placed the journal on the table, opening it to the final entry. "This journal belonged to Yuki's lover," he began. "It details everything he did, and more importantly, everything he knew about you." Sato's face paled as he glanced at the journal. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I have nothing to do with her death." Takashi leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Sato's. "You can deny all you want, but the truth is in these pages. Yuki found out about your dealings, and you couldn't let her expose you. You and your associates covered up her death, making it look like an accident." Sato's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "I never meant for her to die," he muttered. "She was just supposed to be scared off." "But she did die," Hiroshi interjected, his voice calm but firm. "And her spirit has been restless ever since. We're here to make sure she finds peace and to ensure that justice is served." Sato slumped back in his chair, defeated. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. Takashi took a deep breath. "First, you will confess everything." You will tell the authorities what really happened, and you will face the consequences of your actions. Second, you will fund a memorial for Yuki, a place where her family and friends can honor her memory. Saturn nodded, his resistance broken. I'll do it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Takashi and Hiroshi stood up, their mission accomplished. As they left the house, Takashi felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice for Yuki was finally within reach. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Sato's confession made headlines, and the authorities began investigating the cover-up. Yuki's story was finally being told, and her memory was being honored. The village of Mizukawa came together to build a beautiful memorial for Yuki. A serene garden filled with her favorite flowers. Takashi attended the opening ceremony, standing beside Hiroshi and the villagers, who had come to pay their respects. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Takashi felt a sense of closure. He knew that Yuki's spirit was finally at peace. He stayed in Mizukawa for a while, helping the villagers and getting to know the people who had known Yuki. The village, once shrouded in shadows, now felt like a place of healing and hope. Takashi found solace in the simple beauty of the countryside, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the soft murmur of the river. One evening, as he walked through the village, he felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Yuki, her form translucent in the fading light. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." Takashi smiled back, tears in his eyes. "You're welcome," he replied. As Yuki's spirit faded into the twilight, Takashi knew that his journey had come to an end. He had faced the shadows of the past and had brought light to a dark place. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. With a final look at the serene village of Mizukawa, Takashi set off on a new path, carrying with him the memory of Yuki and the lessons he had learned. The night was clear, the stars bright above him, guiding him forward into a future filled with hope and possibility. And so Takashi's journey continued, a journey of healing, discovery, and the unending search for truth. The haunted hitchhiker had found peace, and Takashi had found a new purpose. The road ahead was long, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready for whatever lay ahead, ready to face the darkness and bring light to those who needed it most.